Hello, you're watching Transbrations, and I'm your host, Nishan Dion. Thank you for joining us. Today's Alison Rose Jefferson is a third-generation Californian. Her research and professional interests revolve around the intersection of historical memory, American history, the history of the African-American experience in Southern California during the 20th century Great Migration and Jim Crow era, heritage conservation, spatial justice, and cultural tourism. She's also interested in her work's intersections with the experiences of people of African descent in other global settings. Along with other work activities utilizing her knowledge and skills, she has written a book, Living the California Dream, African-American Leisure Sites During the Jim Crow Era. This study examines how African Americans pioneered leisure in Americans' frontier of leisure through their attempts to create communities and business projects in conjunction with the growing African American population of Southern California during the nation's Jim Crow era. The places Jefferson examines illustrate a range of recreation and relaxation production purposes and societal encounters at beach and inland locations. Hello, Alison. Thank you for joining me.
And hello, Nishan. Thank you so much for inviting me to come on to your show.
I'm so happy that you're here. I'm going to give a little bit of context. I reached out to you in, I believe it was January of 2018. You were working on the African American History Contact Statement for the Survey LA, which is historic resources.
It's a report for the city of Los Angeles that gives the context for how the city looks at determining historic buildings that have some significance to the African American experience. Yes.
And I saw some information in there regarding Altadena or Pasadena, and I looked to see who the individuals were, who the authors, the writers, people put the book together, and your name came up. And I believe, were you one of the only African Americans who participated in the project, or were there others?
So in terms of the historic context statement, as far as I know, I was the only African American that worked on that particular part of it.
Okay.
There were some other things that were not necessarily part of the context statement, but were part of Survey LA, where a couple of other African Americans participated in generating the materials for those sections. But in terms of this context statement, I'm the only African American that was working on that.
I'm just trying to figure out why I singled you out.
Right. And I don't remember now. I just remember that that's how we met. And I was like, oh, who is this person with all these questions and all these great ideas about things that you thought that I should be doing? I was like, wow, okay.
Well, I did have a lot of questions. It was the first time, I'm working on my memoir, and it was the first time that I had encountered a document like that. And I was blown away with the history, the historical context, and especially regarding African Americans. There were information regarding Biddy Mason. I didn't know that history. There was a significant amount of information that was interesting to me.
Yeah, that you found, useful.
Yes.
In some way or another.
Yes, in some way or another. So
yeah.
Do you have any activists, artists, filmmakers, writers, intellectuals, or civil servants in your family?
Yes. Not necessarily everybody all like around me right now in terms of my family, but my family, on both sides of my family, were people that were able to take advantage of their freedom after the Civil War and during Reconstruction. And they were able to do lots of different things. They were farmers. Some of them got education. They became teachers. Then some of them got more education. They became doctors. Some of them became other kinds of business people in the 20th century, a couple of public intellectuals. All of them were creative in some kind of way. My mom she went to college, and she went to Howard University, And she grew up in Los Angeles, but she went to Howard University. And so when she was in school, she painted. And I have a painting that she did when she was in junior high school. And my uncles played instruments. And my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, she would write poetry. She didn't necessarily write it all the time, but I have a couple of poems that she wrote that I found in, various things that have been passed down through the years. So, and in terms of activism, they were all activists in certain ways because of the fact of their lives. My grandparents, my maternal grandparents, they were educated. They moved to California in the 1920s. They bought a new car. They were in Montgomery, Alabama. My grandmother was from Birmingham. She had gone to Miles College. My grandfather, my maternal grandfather, was from a little town, Barbersville, near Charlottesville, Virginia. And he had gone to Howard University Medical School, and he was down there at Tuskegee doing his residency. And he met my grandmother, and they decided they wanted to get married and have a family. They said they didn't want to live there anymore, and they bought a new car and drove to California. So in their mobility, that was activism. And then on my father's side, his family was involved in forming businesses in the 19th century. In Atlanta, they opened a cemetery. The same year Coca-Cola was opened in 1886, called, it's still there, at Southview Cemetery. And one of my family members runs it now. And so they were activists in terms of establishing a business, and they were involved in various civil rights efforts there in Atlanta. But just getting an education, as far as I'm concerned, in the 19th century and early 20th century was an act of activism.
The family that you grew up in, exactly who do you feel like who had the most influence on you regarding your career goals?
I don't think any one of my family members had any more influence over another in terms of how I evolved as a person, because I've had multiple careers. You're getting to me now in terms of my work as a historian. Although I've always been interested in history, I came to this portion of my work life later, after I had worked in finance and I had worked in the entertainment business and PR and marketing, managing various situations in terms of the music business. And but I had always been kind of a fish out of water in that area. So I would say the fact that my parents and my grandparents and my uncles and aunts were all people that established themselves in whatever they were doing. They may not have been people that were out front in their communities or anything like that, but they were productive and constructive members of whatever community they were living in. I did have one uncle who wrote a significant book in the 60s. His name is Price Cobbs, and he wrote this book called Black Rage with William Greer. And that book talked about the reason why Black people were angry in terms of the 60s psychologically, because of all the craziness that we had to deal with. And so that was a different kind of activism in terms of something that was, he was a public intellectual on some level. And he was a psychiatrist, but he went on to have a business career using his psychology. So, I mean, maybe indirectly that was something that was there in my path, because my parents, even though both of my parents were school teachers, they also were entrepreneurs from the standpoint that my father had apartment buildings, you know, and he would have done that full time if he figured out he could have made all the money he needed to, but he was, he had to have that little base. The teaching thing was a base.
Okay.
And my mother, she bought a house and then she bought a duplex. So, so they did what they could do to better themselves in their lives. And my mother was active with different organizations at different times during my life, but I can't say that they were particularly social activists beyond their own realm of work and lives.
Okay. One of the best things about growing up in Los Angeles is the proximity to the dozens of beaches. And I grew up and fell in love with Venice more so than Santa Monica. What are your earliest memories of Southern California beaches?
So my earliest memory of the beach is going to the beach with my mother. Mm-hmm. And she would take us during the summer up to the beach at Topanga Canyon. Actually, no, I'm sorry, at sunset, because I think, one, it was a nice beach. It was easy for her to park. There was a restaurant sometimes open, and there were bathrooms, and there were lifeguards. So she could park, she could sit on the beach, watch us. There were sometimes other kids there for us to play with. And we always had a nice time at that beach. As a child, I don't remember going to Venice or Santa Monica Beach unless we were going to Pacific Ocean Park. And that was EOP.
You just mentioned Topanga. Is that further?
I said we went to Santa Monica. We went to Sunset. We went to the beach at sunset. I said Topanga and I said that incorrectly. We went to the beach at sunset.
Which beach? Santa Monica?
That's not Santa Monica. That's Will Rogers Beach.
Oh, Will Rogers, which is up there near Malibu, right?
It's north of Santa Monica. It's not quite to Malibu. It's near Sunset.
Okay, I know. Okay, I know that. Okay, I have geographically, I know where it's at.
It's where that restaurant is. I can't think of the name of it right now. Reardon owns it. It's right there at Sunset. Gladstone's. It's where Gladstone's.
Gladstone's. Did you ever think that you would see Venice Beach deteriorate the way it has?
So I didn't go to Venice Beach until I was like in junior high and high school. Mm-hmm. And I never thought of it as deteriorating. Even today, I don't think of it as deteriorating. A lot of people have always talked about Venice as being crummy. I never thought of it as being crummy. It just was old. And like I said, what I recall about going to the beach in Santa Monica and Venice when I was a kid was going to Pacific Ocean Park. And I remember being on the roller coaster and going out over the ocean and looking at the water. And the last time that the memory that I have that's most vivid in my memory about that experience was going there with my Uncle Prince. He took my brother and I one day. And I don't know whether he took us because this was right before they were going to close or what, but I just remember being on that roller coaster over the water. And so that's really what I remember as a child about the beach there. And my next memories are when I'm like in high school and college and walking up and down the boardwalk, not necessarily going to the beach. And I remember the artists and people selling stuff, not unlike it is today, but it was a little different in terms of how it was situated. Yeah. And I, like I said, in terms of deterioration, it was old then, it's still old if you're thinking about the boardwalk.
Well, I'm talking about more so with the homeless and the crime and the violence and just how the climate has deteriorated.
Well, maybe in terms of your experiences, but I don't have those.
Oh, okay. I see what you're saying. Right.
You know, so I'm not having those experiences. Yes, I've seen the homeless people, but I don't feel that's deterioration. in the sense of maybe the way you do. It's unfortunate, but hey, everybody likes the beach.
Oh, no, 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 no. It's not that I necessarily feel like it's deteriorating. I'm more so, this is from things that I'm reading, reports, news stories. It's a public place. Everyone has the right to go there.
Right. If somebody's looking at it from the standpoint of gentrification, yeah, it's deteriorating because those people want something pristine, one type of gentrification. They want something pristine. But, humanity is humanity. And so for me, yeah, sometimes it's not looking too cool, but, you just keep moving. Everybody everybody needs to have a place to be.
I've been going there for 3 decades. There were always homeless people. It was always this bohemian feel. So, obviously the homeless situation has gotten worse. And so there, just happens to be more out there. They do have to go somewhere. So when did you start learning about Black surfers and the Inkwell?
So I started this research in terms of the African-American experience in Santa Monica in 2000, say like 2004, 5, 6, in that time period, because I was in graduate school working on a master's degree in heritage conservation. And so that's when I started to learn about this African-American community in Santa Monica and Venice. And that's when I first learned about this surfer, African-American and Mexican-American surfer. And then around that time, I also learned about Black surfers who were more contemporary folks. And some of those people happened to be folks who had been in Los Angeles for a couple, their families had been in Los Angeles for a couple of generations. And so my knowledge just kind of blossomed from there. And then the Black surfer community, also going around trying to figure out themselves more who they were and looking at trying to engage more folks in the joys of surfing. And it's blossomed since then.
And that person you're talking about is Nick, how do you say it? Nick Gabaldon?
Yes, he was the African-American and Mexican-American surfer in Santa Monica, who has become Nick Gabaldon, who has become a folk hero to many because of his pioneering efforts at surfing in the 1940s. He died in a surfing accident at 24 in 1951.
And so what's the background regarding Nick Gabaldon Day?
So that was started by the Black Surfers Collective in conjunction with, it was started by the Black Surfers Collective. And the day became more of, and it was an activity to share the joy of surfing by giving free surfing lessons. And then by 2012, 13, they've expanded into a bigger program because I helped them to hook up with Heal the Bay and the Santa Monica Conservancy, and then Heal the Bay helped them to hook up with Surf Bus so that they were able to get more people involved who were able to give free surfing lessons. And so we've been rolling along with this event to engage people in looking at the history of the site, getting a surfing lesson, enjoying the beach, and learning about ocean stewardship and what that means.
And were you involved in the documentary based on him? It was a short documentary, about 30 minutes. Were you involved in that one?
Yes, I was. Yes, that was produced by Nike, and the director was Richard. I've forgotten his last name right now. That's terrible. Oh.
What area is designated as the Inkwell?
So the area that African Americans used to hang out at during the Jim Crow era, which was the era when Black people's rights were more pressed down than they are today, from 1900 to 1964, in terms of the Los Angeles region, was initially from Pico down to Bicknell Street. When the hotels or the beach clubs came in the 20s, the area got pushed a little further south, so that it's more remembered today as between Bay and Bicknell Street, in front of the park that's there, the Crescent Bay Park. And so that area in 2008 got a local plaque from the city of Santa Monica. They put up a plaque to commemorate that area. And then in 2019, as an area that African Americans hung out at. And in 2019, myself and Michael Blum with the Sea of Clouds organization did the research to get it listed on the National Register of Historic Places. It's the only historic district in Santa Monica that has this national recognition, and it's one of the few in California that's associated with any community of color or intentionally marginalized group.
Have you ever tried to surf?
Yes, I have.
How did it go?
It was fun, but I don't have time to do that. And when I was a kid, we body surfed and swam in the ocean, but we weren't surfing, and stand-up surfing. And as an adult, I've done it a few times, but it takes a lot of time to do, and I'm not. I just don't have that kind of time to donate to something like that. I enjoy it. I mean, I enjoy going into the ocean, and if I lived near the ocean, maybe I might do it more often. I mean, not that I live that far from the ocean, but I don't live like I don't live
walk down there.
Yeah, I can't walk down there.
Yeah. So I'm familiar with the Inkwell 1994 romantic comedy drama film, but I had never heard of the Inkwell regarding Santa Monica and African Americans. Where does the Inkwell name come from? What does it mean?
So that name is something that was used all over the country by white people to talk about places that African Americans hung out that were around waterways. And it was not a positive reference. It was a derogatory reference that relates to the darker skin color of African Americans. And there were other names that white people called these places also that weren't as nice as Inkwell. And so with that, we got that name at the place in Southern California. And some Black people all over where these places have gotten those monikers have repurposed it as a badge of pride. But there's some people who even today and in the past never would call the place the Inkwell. And in fact, in terms of Santa Monica and that name, there were a lot of people that used the place that would just say, I'm going to the beach in Santa Monica if they were Black, and everybody knew where they were talking about because that's where Black folks hung out. It wasn't that it was segregated from the standpoint that there was an imposed segregation in the formal sense of the word, that they put up signs that said, this is the only place Black people could hang out on the beach, because you couldn't do that in California. That was illegal. We had civil rights laws that said beaches were open to everybody. Now, sometimes those laws were not enforced and Black people might be harassed on the beach, but they could also fight that harassment on the beach and sue or take some kind of claim to, court and win victory in terms of these people not being able to discriminate against them.
Okay. Walking on Water is a brief history of Black surfers at the Inkwell. What was your contribution to that film?
Yeah, it's not so much a brief history of Black surfers as it is a history of the program that we have been doing there. You're talking about the Rasan Nichols film, right?
Yes.
Yeah, at the program we've been doing with kids. So, I mean, you could say the history of Black surf, but it's really more about the program we've been doing with kids at that beach site over the last few years. And that's revolving around Nick Gabaldon Day. And so, yeah, I help to give the content to the film for the filmmaker. And I do talk about the history of that site in the film. It's a very short film, and it was well done. It won a couple of awards.
Oh, okay. So we have something in common. We were both volunteers at Heal the Bay. I volunteered there in 2005, and I would do the tabling. I would go out into the community. I remember going to Culver City, and it's basically pretty much like community outreach, letting people know about Heal the Bay and the environmental aspects of the beach and all of that. And yeah, that's my memory, jogging my memories from 15 years ago. And I worked at their fundraiser. It was under a big tent in the Santa Monica parking lot. So that was in 2005. How did you get involved with Heal the Bay, and what were you doing there?
So one of the Black surfers who is, you call him an OG of surfing as a Black person, Rick Blocker, when we were involved with the Whitewash documentary film, he and I were trying to figure out ways to get it exposed to the public. And he one day suggested to me, well, why don't you call Heal the Bay and see if they're interested in showing the film? And I reached out to them, and Meredith McCarthy, who is the director of public engagement programs for Heal the Bay, and she was like, yeah, we like this film and we want to do something with it. And so we figured out that the film, we could show it. And then I came to her with the idea of doing the Nick Gabaldon Day programming. And we would show the film, and we could show the film as part of that. And she was like, yeah, let's do that. And I already had, at that point in time, I had the opportunity to talk with Mark Ridley Thomas. He was the county supervisor at that time. And he was interested in the film and getting people to learn about the ocean being for everybody. And so we were able to get funding from him to support this bigger Nick Gabaldon Day than what the Black surfers had done in the year past. And so that was in 2012, 2013. And so that's how I started working with them. It was about trying to look at, for me, sharing the story of African Americans at this site. And ocean steward, and it intersected with the ocean stewardship. And I'm a big advocate of multiple ways of reaching people. And so with that, in terms of multiple ways of reaching people, it was great. Oh, let's connect with Heal the Bay. Yeah. I hadn't been involved with them before. Not to say that I wouldn't have supported them, but generally speaking, in terms of the things that I have been, I was emerging in terms of my work in history. And I was also looking at various theoretical constructs in how to share information. And so it started out as an exercise.
In 2007, you earned a master's degree in heritage conservation at USC. And in 2015, you earned your doctorate in history at UC Santa Barbara. What is the role and the purpose of a historian and heritage conservation consultant?
So heritage conservation consultant is somebody who's really involved with looking at the broader ways in which you preserve place in the built and natural environment. And there's some people that are much more focused on historic preservation aspects of it in terms of the American ideology of it, which is really about preserving aesthetics of buildings and architecture. When you start talking about heritage conservation, that expands it a little more, and you are looking at preserving these structures and these places and natural environments more for a social construct rather than for an aesthetic construct. And you aren't necessarily looking at this place has to be listed on some national, state, or local registry to say that it's important. You could do other things like what we did in Santa Monica with the Belmar History Plus Art Project, where we're recognizing a lot of African-American history in the South Santa Monica Beach neighborhoods, people, places, and events. Some of the places that we talk about in that project that has 15 panels and a piece of artwork at 4th and Pico and a context essay and lesson plans are sites that you could list on some landmark registry, but some of the sites are not places you could list on a landmark registry because based on those criteria, those zoning criteria, they might not qualify, but that doesn't mean they aren't important.
Okay. After receiving your doctorate and your master's in heritage conservation, how did you chart your career path, or did you do that before?
And so the other thing is, you know, a historian is also looking at our experiences and changes over time. And so that intersects with looking at what is done in heritage conservation, but they can also be separate things. A historian could be looking at solely people and not necessarily places. And so as it relates to my career charting, when I went back to graduate school to get my master's in heritage conservation, I thought I was going to work in heritage conservation for the rest of my career. But after I got into it, I realized that there was more that I wanted to do than to work in the American context of historic preservation, which is building based. I was interested in a broader platform of stories around the African-American experience, and getting a PhD was going to allow me to have that broader platform to work from. I didn't want to work at a consulting firm or for a city government doing exercises around landmarking a building so that a city could say that they're not tearing down the culture of a neighborhood. It's very political in terms of historic preservation, and I don't want to get into all of that right now, but I can't say that I charted my career in the sense of I knew exactly what I was going to do. I did know, and one of the reasons why I decided to apply to get into a PhD program, that I had some more stories that I wanted to tell. And I had done this paper when I was working on my master's degree, where I did a little bit of work on all of these leisure sites that I talk about that I wound up talking about in work that I continued in the PhD program, writing papers on, and all of that work that I had done with the master's program and the PhD program became part of my dissertation. And then much of that work became part of a book. So from the kind of, way of thinking about most people, they get a master's in heritage conservation, they go to work in heritage conservation. And that's what they do. Most people that get a PhD are going to go into academia. That might have been a path for me, or it might still be. But I was really much more interested in doing programs outside of the academic institution. And that's what my career has been thus far. So I worked on the Survey LA document, and I worked on that as a historian. It's the context history of the African-American experience in Los Angeles about the places that people lived. And then with that, you could take that context and say, oh, migration experience, oh, nightclub and entertainment experience. And those stories could shed some light on the Bay Street Beach in Santa Monica, or the Central Avenue Dunbar Hotel. And so that's a landmark. And that's what that study is interested in helping people to figure out. Okay. And so for me, I wanted to be able to do other kinds of projects.
Alice, we want to keep your answers to at least 3 minutes, okay?
I know you keep saying that, but I don't have a clock in front of me and I can't, you know.
No, I know. Well, I mean, that's fine, but just cut it short some, because we have, there's, you know, other stuff to, because we want to get into your book too. So your work requires a significant amount of reading, research, analysis, writing, and speaking. What aspects do you enjoy the most?
So I like all of it. I like all of it. There's sometimes when I prefer one part of it or over another, but I like all of it. I as a public speaker, I wish I could be a little more fluid than I am. I usually have to have a script, you know, and some of my colleagues are like, no, you need to like let go of that script because you're a great storyteller. Yeah. And I'm like, I'm working on it.
So Mitrice Richardson was a beautiful young Black female, and she was a college graduate. And in September of 2009, after eating a meal at Geoffrey's in Malibu and not paying for it, she was arrested and taken to Malibu Lost Hills Sheriff Station in Calabasas. She was later released, and it was like in the early, it was still, the sun hadn't came up yet. She was released, and she went missing. On January the 9th of 2010, 4 months after she was reported missing, the LA County Sheriff's Department conducted one of the largest scale searches in the department's history. Over 300 volunteers trained in search and rescue operations participated in an 18 square mile search in Malibu Canyon. The search included air and ground searches of creeks, trails, and ridges, and Mitrice was not found. But in August of 2010, park rangers found her body in a ravine. Her story received national media attention, exposing race, class, and police misconduct. To my knowledge, Mitrice was the first documented Black person missing in a coastal city, which caused intense alarm and search for her. Do you remember Mitrice's story and how it played out in the media?
Yeah.
Were there does anything stick out to you?
You called out everything already. I mean, you know, so, I mean, it was an unfortunate situation in terms of this young Black woman who, from what I recall, she was troubled a little bit. And so, you know, they still don't know what happened to her. No. And so it was an unfortunate situation.
And the LA County, I think it was the LA County Board of Supervisors, I think they had an initial $10,000 reward. They recently increased it to $20,000.
And then there's another this is a teenager, little girl in South Los Angeles who they found her body. She's dead on the side of a freeway on-ramp. Yes. And so I'm sure that also, you know, rekindled interest in this young woman who, you know, died up in Malibu. And so it was just tragic what happened to that girl.
That young black girl, that was about almost a year ago or 9 months ago?
No, it's been like within the last
6 months.
Yes.
Okay. Mitrice's story was I don't think anyone has ever went missing in LA County in that area like that.
Well, you know, I don't know. I can't say. But in terms of an African-American woman in contemporary times, that's the first story like that I'm aware of, you know, a woman who obviously she was somebody who, in terms of class, had the ability to get into a fancy smancy restaurant in Malibu. Mm-hmm. So she knew somewhat of where she was.
Mhm.
Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yes.
And so with that, there's class and sexism and racism that plays into how they treated her, in terms of, letting her out of jail in the middle of the night.
Well, and not only that, her grandmother had talked to the management on the phone and had agreed to pay the bill.
I didn't
But
know about that.
yeah, but they still had her arrested. There was another case, since you brought that young Black girl up on the freeway. There was another case, a Black female was thrown out of a car. I believe she was thrown out of a car on there's the 110 freeway and the 7 near the 710 freeway and the 105. And I believe she was naked. And this happened about, I want to say maybe 10, 12, 13 years ago. And I don't, if memory serves me correct, they had never found, the people that were.
I don't remember anything about that particular story.
Yeah, they had never, it was just alarming when I had heard that.
Yeah, it's alarming.
it is alarming. So Living the California Dream is your book that was published in 2020. We talked earlier, you mentioned your doctoral that you drew from. Did you also draw from your family stories or experiences regarding racism at California leisure sites?
So yes, I did. I don't know that I would say it was racism, but what I recall in terms of one of the things that got me interested in these stories is when I was a little girl, my mother and my uncles talked about going to Lake Elsinore. And they would go up there during the summer when they were kids. And so I knew about that experience. And then one time when I was a little kid in the 1960s, they took me and my family members, my brother, my cousins and my uncles, and my 2 uncles and my aunt, my grandmother, we all went up there on this family trip. And it was the first time that they had all done that in probably at that point in time, 20 or 30 years. And so I always had that in my mind as something that I thought was interesting, because when I was growing up, my parents they were divorced and they didn't take us on vacations where we stayed overnight someplace that wasn't a family member's house. Okay. And so I was kind of intrigued by that. And then another trip we went on out there in the late 60s, because we had some distant relatives that lived there. We went to visit them and they had like an acre and they had a little farm. So I was just kind of interested in that. And I have one photograph of us all there, me in my little green bathing suit, pulling on my bathing cap, and the rest of the family in this picture. So it was something that I had experience with, but I didn't know in detail about the African-American experience with these kinds of sites in terms of Black people forming them themselves until I started doing research.
And what was the writing and publishing process like for you?
So I wrote the book over a 10-year period, because I started some of the work on Lake Elsinore. That was my thesis that I did in my master's program. And then when I got to, and so I did research in public archives, like the library, in their photo collections and newspaper collections. And then I did research in people's private collections, because they had old photographs and stuff that weren't in the public arena. I did oral histories with people over. And
how do you find those individuals?
So all of this came through networking. I started, I asked my uncle about this and he told me a story. And then there were some gentlemen who actually were my uncle's contemporaries that I would see all the time, just in Los Angeles. And then I asked Leroy Beavers one day. I asked him one day, well, did you go to Lake Elsinore, to this beach in Santa Monica? And he said, yeah, da 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 da. And you should go and talk to so-and-so. And I went and talked to Halvar Miller. And Hal had all this information about his family's experience going to Santa Monica, going to Lake Elsinore. And he was a great storyteller himself. He was a lawyer. And Hal had pictures, and he knew all these stories about all these different families in Los Angeles. And so he led me to people. And then if my mother had been alive, she would have led me to people too. But then I recalled, you know, some of her friends, and I asked some of my mother's friends who were still alive about places. And then they came up with a couple of them came up with some great documents that nobody has, that are in the public domain. They were in their private stuff that they had saved over, you know, almost 100 years now. But at that time, it would have been 80 years. Same, you know, I looked in census records. So I found materials all over the place in terms of the research to create the book. And in terms of the book, since it was an outgrowth of my dissertation, I knew when you go and get a PhD, you're looking to get a book, okay?
Thank you.
I was lucky in that the University of Nebraska Press approached me. They saw a paper that I was doing at a conference, the National Conference on Public History. They weren't even there. The editor, Bridget Berry, wasn't even at the conference, but she's looking through the conference bulletins at different paper titles that might be something that she's interested in. And so she reached out to me, and, you know, I liked her, and they were a good press. They are an academic press. They do mostly academic books, people who have PhDs, but they do other books that are not necessarily from PhDs.
That you know of for academic books, do they have to submit nonfiction proposals? I mean, sorry, do they have to submit book proposals?
Everybody has to submit a book proposal. So then she told me she was interested. She said, when you finish your dissertation, reach out to me, and then we'll see about what our next steps are. And so then I put together a proposal. And then she said, because, you know, sometimes people, they don't finish their dissertations. You know what I'm saying?
I heard,
they don't finish. But I mean, I know a couple people that never finished their dissertations. They work in publishing too. It just was, you know, they review other people's materials, but they weren't able to get all the work done to get a dissertation done. They decided that wasn't for them. Okay. So anyway, that's why she's like, well, when you get finished, let me know, and then we'll go from there. And so I submitted the proposal. And then within 2 weeks, she turned it around and said, we want it. And that's how that happened. There were a couple of other presses that I submitted to, but since they turned around so fast, it was like, I just go with them. They're a good press from the standpoint that they do Western history. And, you know, I looked at some of the trade press, but that's a much longer process. I wanted to get the book out. And I can go to a trade press for another book. Most people have agents when they do those kinds of things.
And so you didn't have one?
I didn't have an agent. I didn't need one for this.
Yeah. So what has your community and family's response been to your book?
So family, I don't have a big family, but everybody is very pleased that I have had this accomplishment. And in terms of the community, a lot of people have been really appreciative of learning about this history that they didn't know anything about. Like I just did a presentation last week on something that people didn't know anything about, which is the site of El Camino College at Redondo and Crenshaw. African Americans attempted to develop a community there in the same time period that Bruce's Beach in Manhattan Beach was being closed down 3 miles away through eminent domain proceedings to take the land away from the Black folks. Gordon Manor was in the formation stages in 25 and 26. And the white folks took that through eminent domain to eventually create a park and the community college and the golf course. They didn't get all that done until the late 1940s. It was a newspaper article, and people were like, "Oh, I didn't know anything about that." And El Camino's celebrating their history right through here. I forget how many years it is.
So are you working on writing any other books, maybe in any other genres, or what's?
So right now, I have started doing some research for some sort of manuscript and public project on the African-American Venice enclave, which was part of the Santa Monica community in the early 20th century. It's now more of its own separate community, but they are related in the sense that there are people that have been in school together and they have friends, but it's more separate because there's more people. And so I'm working on research for that. I don't know what kind of manuscript that's going to turn out to be. My book has been optioned to be a TV series around the Bruce's Beach story. So we're kind of, gearing up for that. That's with Brad Pitt, Viola Davis, and Amazon. And
how did you celebrate that news?
I didn't really celebrate it. It's not a TV show yet. I mean, they optioned the book. We had to do all this paperwork, and
but for the book to receive that attention,
how exciting was that? Happy about that. Yeah, I mean, celebrate from the standpoint that I might have had a glass of champagne, but until we have a TV show, it doesn't really mean anything. I mean, you get a little excitement out of it, and and then I mean, they made a public announcement about it, but
it may or may not materialize.
Right. At this point, I think it will, because it's been such a hot topic in terms of the media attention that the story of Bruce's Beach has gotten in terms of the Bruce family and their business and the potential that the Los Angeles County may do some sort of restitution to the family.
I'm going to read a quote, okay? On September the 30th, California Governor Gavin Newsom signed Senate Bill 796 into law, which authorized the return of Bruce's Beach to the descendants of Black landowners who were disposed of the property in the early 20th century. Living the California Dream devotes a chapter to the history of Bruce's Beach. How did you feel when you heard the news that Gavin Newsom had signed Bill 796 into law, returning the land back over to its original owners?
So I think it's a wonderful thing that that's happened, but I think we have to remember that this is only benefiting one family in terms of some sort of financial restitution. It's not benefiting all the other Black people. The only benefit that it provides to other Black people is that it gives them hope that things can continue to get better for them, and that and so it's a psychological benefit that other people are getting out of this. But Black people have lost out on that socioeconomic cultural space over the last 100 years, and we can't forget about that legacy. There's 35,000 people that live in Manhattan Beach. Only less than 0.5% are Black. So that's less than 200 people. So that is the legacy of pushing the Black people out of there in the 1920s. If Black people had been able to stay there with that business, who knows what kind of community that might be, or potentially the Bruces might have become like the Hiltons. Conrad Hilton was starting his hotel business in New Mexico also, I mean, the Bruces were in New Mexico before they moved to Los Angeles and then started their business in Manhattan Beach. He started his hotel business in his father's store in New Mexico.
Wow.
So what if, you know, the Bruces had had the same kind of opportunity to continue their business?
Mhm.
Okay, what if other African Americans could see that they had that venture there and then they were inspired and they created other ventures? What if segregation, or rather not segregation, what if discrimination and white supremacy had been null and white people supported Black businesses? Okay, one of the reasons why a lot of Black businesses failed after the end of segregation was because white people weren't supporting the businesses and Black people stopped supporting them too and went to support the white people's businesses because they had more opportunities of places to go. So if we didn't have the discrimination, there might be a whole lot of other things going on in terms of Black economic power at this point in time.
Yeah. During your early career, you worked in entertainment and marketing. When you initially started researching and writing your book, did you aspire for it to be developed into a TV or film project? What was your vision?
So I knew that in terms of the stories that I was uncovering and researching, that they were very interesting to me, and I thought that they might be interesting to other people.
Mm-hmm.
So as a person who's interested in history reaching a broader audience, everything was on the table for me in terms of what might become of the work that I produced. I could not say that that was necessarily the direct path that I was going, because it wasn't. It was really more about, let's engage audiences of various types with these stories. And the fact that I had this book, that I put together these interesting stories, and that it got picked up for a TV series says that I was right.
You did it. You were right. At what point when and how did...
I have that project in Santa Monica, also the Belmar History Plus Art Project.
You on a roll, Alison. Alison, at what point when did Bruce's Beach come onto your radar?
So when I first started doing this research, when I was working on my master's degree in 2004, 2005, that's when I learned about it. I didn't know anything about it before that time. It wasn't something that had percolated up in terms of my knowledge of Los Angeles experience. And during that time, there were a couple people that were writing about different aspects of the African-American experience in Los Angeles that had not been written about before. And Bruce's Beach was one of them. And so that was when I learned about it.
I had never heard of Bruce's Beach until I read your book.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to read a quote. Your applied history project work and book, Living the California Dream, were honored with the 2020 Miriam Matthews Ethnic History Award by the Los Angeles City Historical Society for exceptional contributions to the greater understanding and awareness of Los Angeles history. You have participated in numerous public programs, including ongoing history public engagement events, lectures, museum exhibitions, oral history interview research, the creation of commemorative monuments, landmark site designations, and documentary films. As your audience grows and your work gains more attention, do you worry about the cancel culture?
I've already experienced that from the standpoint of some people in terms of the not liking the fact that, in terms of Manhattan Beach, some of those people down there not liking the fact that I wasn't going to jump on board with some nonsense that they were spouting out in terms of...
Hold on, Alison. So are you saying you've already been canceled?
They tried to cancel me, but the work is so strong that, they couldn't. They were
Cancel this, baby.
They were trying to nullify my work because I didn't want to participate in some things that the city government was doing. I told them no. And so then, because I didn't want to play ball with them the way they wanted to, then they went on and did some other things, and then tried to say that my work was not the work that helped them to figure out the history of Manhattan Beach. They have a history committee that they put together to look at the history. Well, where did they get that history? They got it from my book.
They tried to discredit you?
There you go.
Oh, wow. And I know there's some, I don't remember his name, but I just read it today. There's some actor on Netflix who got canceled because he was in a scene with the main actress. And I guess after the director had said cut, I guess something happened and she was like, why are you still touching me? I don't remember the all of it, but, and he wrote about being canceled. And I was reading this article and there were 124 comments. And I asked people that I interview, you know, how do they feel about cancel culture? Because so many people are silenced just because of their gender, their race, socioeconomic background. You know, so many people don't have platforms and will never have platforms. And then when people are doing work or in certain positions and stuff, and something happens, and it, you know, definitely things should be investigated, or, you know, if there's a situation, you know, some conflict should be taken care of. But it seems as if now it's just this culture that we're living in where people are just taking shots at people and just all these crabs pulling people down.
Well, in terms of my work, white supremacists don't like my work. Okay. People who are not interested in the history being told in terms of the broader reference to how Black people were treated in certain communities, they don't want to hear it.
No.
And that's the problem with Manhattan Beach. But, you know, hey, they went on and did what they wanted to do. That's fine. But it hasn't impacted me.
Right.
Okay. It hasn't, my book is my book. Okay.
Alison, can you, will you repeat after me? Hi, haters.
Hi, haters.
Yes. Thank you, Alison. Thank you. Hello, haters. You're watching Transbrations. Alison Rose Jefferson, and she is the author of
Living the California Dream, African-American Leisure Sites During the Jim Crow Era.
Yes. So your unique blend of academic training and work experiences allow you to develop strategies to interpret history in different forms of writing, visual exhibits, and public presentations for contemporary audiences. Want you to discuss Angel Walks. What is Angel Walks?
So Angels Walk is a group that creates these walks around the city, around history, people, places, and events. And one of the ones that they did that I worked on was the Central Avenue Heritage Trail. And it runs from around 24th Street down to just south of Vernon. And there's 15, 16 stanchions on the street. And they have stories, stanchions, these big, you know, markers on the street. And they have stories about different people who impacted the neighborhood, about events that happened, architecture, and things like that. So on one that's up around 24th, it's talking about the theater that's right there. Oh, I can't think of the name of the theater right now, but it's talking about that theater. And there were some contemporary stories that we talked about as well. There's one talking about Liberty Savings and Loan, which was a Black financial institution that was founded in the 1920s that lasted until the 1960s. The Black Panther offices that were on Central Avenue that were bombed by the city police department in the 60s. We have that story on one of the signs. We have one about the Dunbar Hotel, which was originally the Somerville Hotel, and it was built by John and Veda Somerville. And then when they lost it, it became the Dunbar Hotel. And that's the name that most people, by the 1930s, most people remember. It was built in 1928. And it was the convention center for the first NAACP conference that was held in Los Angeles. And then we have some stanchions up about the music scene and what have you. The Angels Walk folks have one walk on Hollywood Boulevard. They've got one in Boyle Heights. They've got one in Chinatown. They've got some in downtown Los Angeles. So it's really about connecting people to their to neighborhoods through walking on the street and using public transportation. I was really happy to be able to participate in putting that Central Avenue one together.
And so tell us about the Belmar History Art multifaceted project in Santa Monica.
So Belmar History and Art is a program that evolved out of the Coastal Commission telling the city of Santa Monica that if they wanted to build this park, they were going to have to recognize the African-American history in the South Santa Monica beach neighborhoods. And the project happened because of my advocacy at the Coastal Commission. I suggested it to them. They were getting ready to vote into play their new social justice, environmental justice policy. And they thought this was going to be a great action to show that they mean business in terms of making for equal access to the beach. And so Santa Monica, as part of the permit condition for them to build this park at 4th and Pico, they were told they had to do something to recognize the history. We didn't know what that was going to be in March 2019 in terms of recognition of the history. It could have wound up just being a plaque, but because the field there that they constructed, this park, didn't cost as much as they thought it was going to, we wound up getting 15 different panels of history around the park with photographs and stories about people, places, and events. A piece of public art. I did the panel histories. And then April Banks did the public art piece that's there. And then we did some community engagement programming, art stuff where April worked with high school students to create art. I worked with high school students to generate some art based on the history, and then other community engagement programs. And then we got lesson plans out of this. Also, I worked with UCLA and master teachers to create it. So, and a context essay. And so all of this is a wonderful way for the African-American community in Santa Monica to be honored. And hopefully it has already opened up some other opportunities for this history to be utilized in terms of this right to return program that the city has implemented, where they have this below market rate housing, and they allowed for people who had been displaced to apply for it and maybe get it. And then also they have another program now where they are getting ready to rehab or create new artwork around the interpretation of the WPA, the Work Progress Administration murals that are in City Hall, WPA murals that are in City Hall that talk about the history of the colonizers, Spanish and Mexican, meeting the indigenous people.
Okay.
And we're going to do some new artwork around that. And they're saying our project is the demonstration project.
For that. Okay, perfect. April 29th marked the 30th anniversary of the LA riots. Do you remember where you were and how the events affected you and your family?
Yes, I do. My uncle, my father's brother, died during that time period. And it wasn't because of the riots. He had, some health issues. And so he died during that time period. And we were all like, looking around at what's going on with the uprising and rebellion, and trying to deal with his memorial and funeral. And I can remember driving down Crenshaw from Inglewood, driving up Crenshaw back to my house, and looking at the National Guard along Crenshaw, because I chose to drive home that way because I knew the National Guard was out there and I wanted to see what was going on. And so that was interesting. I wasn't, and then, you know, we had in my neighborhood, I live in the Miracle Mile, there was some looting that went on. And so that was on the television. And then a friend and I were walking around on, I guess that would have been the first day of the uprising when the looting happened, or the second day, whatever. We were walking around one day and the 7-Eleven had a little fire in it. It was just a food thing, but you know, all kinds of stuff, even over in the West Side neighborhoods.
Do you remember the Firestone on La Brea and Wilshire? Do you remember it was burnt? It burned.
It did. I don't remember that.
Yeah, I wasn't living there at that time, but I was reading and doing some research, and I came across a picture.
Must have been a small fire because it, you know, the structure's still intact, and they've reopened it as a restaurant.
Right. Did any of your family members ever have any negative experiences with the LAPD?
Yes, they did.
It wasn't until my neighbor, pardon me?
Grandparents and my uncles and my mom in the 30s and the 40s had bad experiences with them. And my uncle recounts the experiences in a memoir that he had. There was an accident, and these white people, it was with some white people in a car. My grandparents and the family were in a car, my uncles and my mom, and these white people were in a car, and there was some kind of accident, and they were like, the white people were really hostile to my grandfather and grandmother. And
was the book published?
Was
that book published, his memoir?
Yes.
Is that The Rage?
No, that's another book that he did.
Oh, what's the title of the memoir?
So his memoir is From Rage to Entitlement, My American Story by Price M. Cobbs.
Okay.
And so he talks about, you know, police harassment then. And he also talked about it when he was in high school, some things happening. And for me, I can remember some things when I was a child that, you know, you could say was harassment. I can't tell you the full context of it because I don't remember. But I do remember the Watts riots. And I remember my parents were divorced. He didn't want us to come down to visit him because he was afraid of, and he lived at 120th and Main then, because he was afraid of all the stuff that was going on down there. And he didn't, you know, really want to drive cross town to pick us up. And he said that, you know, the police were coming around the neighborhood and those kinds of things. So, you know, tangentially, I don't ever remember as a teenager being stopped. I know my brother had some issues at one point with the police. And I have friends that were stopped, they were just being black in a car.
Yeah.
It was too nice.
Right, yeah. Did Voices of Rebellion is an event, and it just marked the 30th anniversary of the LA riots. Did you attend that?
No, I've been too busy. Actually, when all that happened, I was out of town. I was in Colorado.
Oh, okay. So how did you feel about the 2020 riots and the damage done to your area? Were you scared?
Call them riots. I don't call them riots. It was a rebellion.
A rebellion?
It was a rebellion. And it was a protest of the police brutality that has been occurring in communities of color around the country. And so in terms of all of that, there were people marching all over my neighborhood. And I at some points was out there looking at it. I didn't participate because I didn't have time for all that, but I was supportive of, you know, what was going on from the not the destruction of property, but from the standpoint of people letting the power structure know that this is unacceptable in terms of this degradation and anti-Black violence that's going on. It's unacceptable. And it just keeps recurring. Okay.
Mhm.
And so people were just at a point that they were like fucking fed up,
Mhm.
you know, and just because we've had in Los Angeles, these 2 rebellions in the last 20 years, doesn't mean we aren't going to have more.
Oh yeah. As long as there's inequality, as long as there's racism and social injustice, there's going to be
There
some
you go.
conflict.
Right. And as long as the police are provoking people in terms of their ways in which they choose to call themselves managing protest. Okay,
And
for
as long as there's, as long as
days, let me just say this, in the last few days, they've been trying to provoke the anti-abortion. I mean, the abortion advocacy people downtown, because they, you know, the way in which they're trying to manage the situation. They're being provocateurs.
And as long as there's unarmed people being murdered at the hands of the police and they're not held accountable, which is an ongoing issue throughout the states. So you mentioned 2020 is a period of reconstruction. Can you elaborate on that?
So I would like to think it was a period of reconstruction. It certainly was a period of reconstruction in the sense of reconstructing the way in which the movement of human rights is moving forward for the next place. It didn't come to pass that we had as many legal benefits that came out of it in terms of laws and what have you. But it did make a lot of people rethink some of their positions in terms of corporations supporting certain kinds of things and realizing that they couldn't be silent on voting rights and other things in different places. In Florida right now, we have Ron DeSantis, who's a jerk, who's trying to limit voting rights. And he's also trying to roll back the rights of people in terms of their humanity, in terms of the various communities with this people say, don't say gay thing, in terms of the educational system and them not wanting to talk about a diversity of people's lived experiences in education and supporting people who are of transgender and other kinds of ways of being. And so when you have that kind of stuff going on, and you have a major corporation, Disney, saying, well, we can't get on board with that, okay? And then the government trying to retaliate against them with, changing the laws in terms of what their business model is. I mean, come on, and we know this guy, he's trying to become president. So he thinks that's going to help him. I don't think so. Not in the long run. That's a short-term move.
Mm-hmm. In 2020, that July, when Congressman John Lewis passed away, we were discussing his service, and you had told me that your family owns Southview Cemetery, and that's where he's now buried at. Are some of your family members buried there as well?
Yes, we have a Watts family plot there. That's my family, my father's mother's family, my father, Albert W. Jefferson, and his mother, Madeira Watts Jefferson. Her family is the one that started that cemetery. And so there is, in the historic part of the cemetery, because there's a historic part and a newer part, there's a family plot there. Yeah.
And so
my grandmother's not there. His mother, she's buried in Baltimore.
Are you any relation to President Thomas Jefferson?
So in terms of our family lineage, we know that my great grandmother came from the Jefferson farm. She married a Humes, and they took her last name because it was more prestigious. He was mulatto. they were both listed as mulatto in the 1880 census. And he was from Bristol, Tennessee.
Mhm.
So we were from the Jefferson farm on that side of the family. So that's my father's, I have to think about that. Yeah, so that's my father's side of the family. So that's my great grandfather on my father's side. So with that, you know, those white people and those Black people, a bunch of them were getting together. So we're not, I don't think we're direct lineage of Jefferson. We haven't been able to get any more information than we know that my great grandmother came from the Jefferson farm, and we don't have a picture of her. But I will say this, when I went to Monticello and I looked at pictures, a variety of pictures of Thomas Jefferson, I was like, there's Uncle Mac. So, you know, Jefferson had other relatives that were there too. So you never know.
You haven't tried the DNA testing?
No.
I mean, I've known you for a few years, and I don't know if I had asked you that, but I wasn't expecting to hear that your great grandmother came from the Jefferson farm. Wow. Wow. You're the first historian that I've ever had a personal friendship and a relationship with. And I love history, and I love learning, and I love knowledge, and I love other people who are, you know, in the intellectual field too. It's just amazing in history, because that's the reason why everything is the way it is now, because of history. So Ketanji Brown Jackson, she was recently appointed a Supreme Court justice. Were you excited about that?
Oh yeah, it's wonderful. You know, and I love that she is, you know, the round the way girl. So with the hair and, you know, what have you, and she's brown, and she's married to a white guy, and she got mixed race kids, and she went to Harvard, and both of her parents were educators. She has all these things that are just wonderful about her in terms of the African American experience.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So over the past 2 years, there's been
The other thing I really like is that she had, in terms of her professional career, that she had a diversity of experiences.
Diversity of experience. How did you feel about the process of her going through the, what did they call it?
The confirmation hearings.
What did you think about that?
So it is what it is. They're always messy.
Very, yeah. They go for the.
Got the job, so who cares?
She did. She got that bag. She got that bag. Over the past 2 years, there's been tremendous talk about reparations for the community. Sheila Jackson and HB 40, and California initiated a task force on reparations. And last December, you provided witness testimony for them. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, that was an interesting experience to participate in that. It's a history-making experience from in terms of the whole process, and hopefully it will inspire other things around the country in terms of people thinking about what is reparations and what does that really mean. For California, they wanted me to talk particularly about the exclusionary things that happened to African Americans in terms of economic development around Bruce's Beach and other African American communities, in terms of Santa Monica, Black people being pushed out of doing beach businesses there, and what have you, and Huntington Beach as well. And so, you know, I think it's very good for this history to be aired in various places, because these folks that were on that commission, none of them really knew this history. So they're learning something about California. They're learning something about the African American experience, and being able to say, oh, that happened here, and then that happened across the country, and what have you. And so with that, there's the similarities and then the dissimilarities in terms of the experiences that African Americans had. And so hopefully they'll be able to come up with some kind of way to do beneficial things for a broad swath of African Americans.
Have you been keeping track of the task force progress?
A little bit, but not really. They've had like 1 or 2 other meetings. And when there's something in the news about it, I pay attention. I've just had so much work to do that.
I know you're so busy.
So I just, you know, I'm not like sitting in on those meetings.
Right.
It's not to say that I wouldn't, that I'm not interested in it. It's just that I have some other things that I have to do right now, so I can only
do so much. I sat in on the meeting.
Patience.
I sat in on the meeting where your panel, and I had learned something new. I learned about Colonel Allensworth State Historic Park in California, and it was a community founded in 1908. I didn't know there were any state parks named after any African Americans in California.
Right. Well, that's the only one, and that happened. Oh, when did that happen? I want to say it happened in the 70s. I may have the wrong year, but it's up there near. It's between Bakersfield and Fresno.
Yeah, going that way.
I've been up there a few times, and in a rural community, you get off the main, you get off the 5, and it's like you driving on 2-lane highway through agricultural area to get over.
The majority of California is rural.
Yes, it's a lot of it is rural. Yes, a lot of
it is rural. So some believe and argue that reparations do more harm than good for our community. How do you feel about that?
Well, I don't know that argument so much. I want my 40 acres and a mule.
Okay. Well, you know, at this point, they should go ahead and make it 120 acres.
And you know, and it doesn't necessarily have to be that you give me the land and the mule. You could give me some cash in terms of, you know, contemporary benefit, because the land may not be where I want to live right now, but I could use that cash.
If no mules are available, would you take pigs or ox or some lamb?
Yeah.
You want those mules? You want what they promised?
I would prefer the cash in terms of.
Yeah, you said you prefer the cash. Yeah.
I could take that cash and invest that.
Right.
Same way that I could invest my labor in those pigs and the land.
Should only descendants of slaves receive reparations? Do you think? Do you feel?
So there's different formulations that have been considered, and in terms of the California formulation, they had said they wanted people to prove that they were descendants of enslaved people, or that they were living in the United States. Their families were living in the United States before the Civil War. I don't have any qualms with that. I just don't know that in terms of how they're thinking about that right now. We'll just have to see how that plays out. You know, there's other formulas that people have come up with that have been discussed. And so, you know, that's one that they came up with. As far as I'm concerned, in terms of all of these things where you start dealing with individuals and trying to give them reparations, you are trying to exclude people. It's a formula of exclusion. And with that, it's because, oh, how much is all this going to cost?
Okay. So
if you do it in terms of a more universal thing, okay, like there's one formulation where you had to say that you've been saying you were Black for at least the last 10 years. Okay.
You've been saying you're Black, or you've lived as a Black person, or you are Black?
Lived, you know, you are Black for the last 10 years. And you can prove that your ancestry, you know, through census records was they were enslaved. I mean, there's different ways to do it. I mean, the way in which the state is talking about right now, some of the proof that they're talking about, I don't know that people are going to be able to find document.
Right.
And so to me, that says exclusion.
Mm-hmm. So since we're talking about reparations, I know the city of West Hollywood is doing they started some kind of program, and Harvard University's endowment is soared to $53.2 billion as of this past June 30th. It's an increase of $11.3 billion, 27% from $41.9 billion a year earlier. Harvard Management Company recorded a 33.6% investment return on endowment assets during the fiscal year 2021, up from 7.3% in the prior year. Harvard recently created a $100 million fund to address its role in slavery. Now, again, Harvard's endowment is $50 billion, and they have the largest endowment in the world. Do you feel $100 million is enough?
Well, it's a start.
Isn't half of that going to go?
It's more than what Georgetown did.
But
what Brown did.
Isn't half of that probably going to go towards like administrative costs and lawyers and?
No, because if they're putting this money into, whatever they're putting it into, it's going to be a nonprofit. And with nonprofits, you can't have your expenses, they're not supposed to have your expenses exceeding a certain amount.
Okay.
So I don't think so, but
okay.
I haven't read all of the materials.
Mm-hmm. For LA County residents, Breathe is a program that is going to give out $1,000 to 1,000 people for 3 years. How do you feel about universal income?
I think it's great if people can qualify for it, I think it's great. Everybody can use a little hand up. There's universal income that comes in other forms, like mortgage tax deductions for high income individuals. That could be considered a form of universal income.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Last spring, when I was in LA, you drove me around the Pico Crenshaw area, and you showed me homes your family lived in, and you shared community history with me. And you also told me about the African-American history of Pico and Arlington. And that was the first time that someone African-American, actually, give me like a little guided tour of the area. And what was that area called right there again? It's Pico and Crenshaw to the right. And then
so if you're east of Crenshaw and north of Pico, that's Country Club Park. If you're west of Pico and west of Crenshaw and south of Pico, and that's where my family lives over there, that's Victoria Circle.
Circle. That's
Venice is Lafayette Square.
And then you also told me about the area over there near Pico and Arlington, the African-American businesses and stuff that used to be there. So I was born in 1978, and I grew up in Altadena, Pasadena, in Los Angeles, near Pico and Western. I have dozens of family members who are Mexican. And March of 1991 is when I started reading the newspapers and wanted to be a broadcast journalist. And ever since the LA Times homicide report was published, I think it was around 2007 or 2008, I took notice of the deaths caused by gun violence. And the majority of those victims were were African-Americans, and Latins were the second. Now, the demographics have changed within the last few years. Now the Latins lead the deaths caused by gun violence. And for me, it's just interesting to see those demographics and to see, I don't want to say half, but a significant amount of the Black population have left. And now you have a lot of the Latins who are in those areas. And now, the gun violence is still going on, and, they're having at it. So
yeah.
What do you think about the demographic change of Los Angeles? Do you have friends or family that have left?
So I know that there are people that have moved from Los Angeles, and they've moved out to some of the outerlying communities for a variety of reasons. Mm-hmm. God bless them. If they like living out there, that's fine. You know, I'm an urban person myself. I don't like having to, for myself personally, I don't want to be in my car on the freeway all the time for things that I want to do. And for those people that have chosen to move out of Los Angeles to these other places, they want another kind of lifestyle. And if that works for them, fine. Like I've been in Rialto a couple of times in the last year with some folks who their families, they were here in Los Angeles and they decided to move out there. Okay, well, they got a bigger house, new house in terms of the last 30 years and or 40 years now. And they like that. You know, their money went further, but then if they were still working in Los Angeles, they had to drive into Los Angeles for work. Okay, people say, oh, the housing's cheaper. Well, it's not really cheaper if you've got to drive to Los Angeles to work.
Expenses.
So you have other kinds of expenses that come into play. But there's some people, they found jobs out in those areas where they moved to, and they're happy. There's some people I know that are in Riverside. They don't come into Los Angeles, you know, regularly. They do what they do out there. I wouldn't want to live out there. It's too hot. I like the water.
Yeah. So what do you enjoy most about the mid-city area? Besides walking around your area a lot, what do you enjoy?
I love the fact that I live near the LA County Art Museum, the Peterson Museum, Farmers Market, the Grove. I can walk over to Beverly Hills to things if I really want to. It's, you know, a couple of miles, but I could still walk to the shopping district in Beverly Hills. I can get to West Hall. I can get anywhere. You know, I don't know why I'm living not in the house I grew up in, but I'm living in the neighborhood that my mother brought us to when I was a little kid. Okay, she divorced my dad. She moved back to her mother's house, and then she got her own house, and it was in this general neighborhood. And my dad was in South Los Angeles in Gardena. And I just have always known that this was a great neighborhood. And I'm sure that when my grandparents and my mother, because my grandparents moved west from the old Central Avenue neighborhoods, I'm sure they were looking at, well, we like this area better than, well, it was the 50s. So West Adams, far West Adams was where Black people were moving. They weren't moving so much they weren't moving yet into Leimert Park.
What high school did you go to?
I went to Gardena High School. I was living with my dad at that point. If I had been over here, I probably would have been at Fairfax or Los
Angeles High School.
Probably not there. Maybe, but yeah, Fairfax, LA, Hamilton, or they might have sent me over to Uni High School.
Do you ever take public transportation?
I do on occasion. I haven't lately, but I do. And that's another thing about this area. You can get on public transportation, you know, pretty easily to get to, like, you could get to the beach from here if on the bus, really easily. On Wilshire, you can get downtown easily.
You can, yeah. So you had mentioned Leimert Park. Leimert Park is undergoing a major revitalization. After several years, the gate around the park was finally taken down, and vendors are demanding equity and social justice. And I think there's some kind of a studio center being built over there right by the mall, behind the mall.
Okay, I don't know about that.
Yeah. Are you excited about Destination Crenshaw and the new subway system?
I think it's great that the subway is going to go through there. Yeah. We'll see what Destination Crenshaw is. Right now, it's an idea. I think, you know, from
no destination.
From the standpoint of it being an idea and what they're going to get up there, it'll be interesting. And hopefully it will bring people to the area. The thing that really has to happen is that, okay, so Marquise Harris Dawson is the city council person there right now who's really behind it. And so he's the one that's raising the money to support it. So, you know, hopefully they'll get the kind of infrastructure together that's not so tied to the city council to support that activity continuing on in a way where it's meaningful to public engagement and it has maintenance that will allow for it to be something that is attractive for people to want to come to it.
Okay. So the LA mayor race has started and Karen Bass is running. And I've been paying attention to politics since 1991. I don't ever remember an African-American female running for mayor of LA. Do you?
Well, yes. Perry ran for mayor.
Who?
Ann Perry.
Oh. Would that have been in the 90s?
No, that's been in the last 15 years.
Oh, okay. Okay.
So she ran, and she didn't win.
She didn't win, yeah.
And then she ran for county supervisor. She didn't win that either. And now she's running for Congress.
Are you excited to see Bass running?
She was on the city council for a long time, and she worked for different folks. She's a dynamic woman, and so, you know.
Are you excited to see Bass running?
I'm not excited about any of these people. It's not a question of being excited. You know, I read and hey, great, you know.
Yeah. Do your thing.
Yeah, exactly. You know, do your thing.
Yeah. So there was a show on Netflix and it was about passing, Blacks passing for other races. And you mentioned that to me. And then I told you about some film that I was watching by, I think her name is, I want to say Julie Dash, the director. I can't think of what it was called, but it was something I had to order it and it was interesting. Have you ever tried to pass for non-Black?
No, that hasn't ever been part of my reality in the sense of something that I ever thought to do. I've been in situations where I've told people that I was African American and they've said to me, well, you don't have to tell anybody you're African American. And I looked at them like, you know, they were crazy. These were people that would have been, I think this was some guy who was of some Middle Eastern extraction that told me that at one point. And I have had at different time periods in my life, I've had people ask me, you know, what my ethnicity is. And it depends on what my hair is looking like. And, you know, and I would be like, I am culturally African American. I don't care what I look like.
Right.
And then if they want to pursue it, then I can have more dialogue with them. But I don't think that I'm particularly a person in looking at me that, I mean, I might look multi-ethnic, but I don't think that I particularly look like I'm not of the African American diaspora.
I think that was the wrong question to ask you if you've ever tried to pass for non-Black. I think I should have formed it in a different way. How do you feel about the whole issue of passing? That's what I should have asked you.
So I've evolved in my thoughts about that. At one point, I was kind of offended to think about people passing.
Oh.
Because I'm like, well, because in terms of my reality, I had a lot of light-skinned folks in my life, and that wasn't what they were doing where I could see it. Okay, let's put it that way. And so from that, I at different times had thought of it as being something that was not acceptable from the standpoint of being a person who revels in my heritage as an African American, okay? And I remember one time being with a friend and we were looking at somebody's art and I said something about this person sometimes passes. And I said it in a way, I don't remember exactly how I said it, but I said it in a way where this friend was like, well, there's nothing wrong with that. And I had to rethink my position. That's been in the last 20 years. I had to rethink my position on that. And I can remember asking my father, who, if he wasn't around Black people and didn't talk about certain things, people might have looked at him and not realized he was Black.
Is
okay?
What's the color like in your family? Is there
All over the place?
All of
Okay. And so, so he could have passed if he was in certain environments. I asked him one time, how come he never passed? And he said, well, why would I want to have done that? Now you have to remember, I'm asking him he's an older person. He's in his 70s when I'm asking him this, his 80s, I can't remember. But that was his response then. He was like, well, why would I have wanted to do that? I wouldn't have been able to see my family. And he's talking about his, his father, his brother, his mother, etc., the relatives that they were in touch with. And, that was kind of the end of the conversation. But then and he was always rather militant from the standpoint of being somebody that, he read a lot, and he was making sure people voted. And he voted, and that we understood voting was important. And then he started the Black History class at his high school where he taught. So, we were always kind of active in that way. And he, at one point, was a waiter as a side job when he was teaching in Baltimore, when he was living in Baltimore, and he tried to get into union organizing. And the white folks told him, if you want this job, you better, stop that union organizing stuff. So he told me that story. Okay. And so that goes to speak to some of that. That was class and race, in terms of that situation that impacted him. And he was of the generation that would have had various kinds of experiences like that, where on some level he is humiliated. You understand what I'm getting at? Now, if he had been, and so there he was a Black person, but maybe if he had been someplace where nobody knew who he was, he could have been a white person.
So can you discuss being a Getty Fellow with the Getty Conservation Institute in LA? What your latest project was?
Yeah, so that was a really wonderful experience. I got a chance to begin doing more in-depth research on the Black Venice enclave. People have done some research on it, but they haven't really pulled out some of the really, really deep stories about a broad swath of the people that formed that community over the last 100 years. And so I am excited that I've been able to begin the process of pulling out some other stories and finding photographs of people that have not been recognized before.
Okay. Who are some of your favorite writers and why?
So, I don't really have any favorite writers at this point in time, because I'm doing a lot of reading, and so I don't really have any favorite writers. I like reading.
What are you reading?
So I'm not reading any books per se right now. I got a library full of books that I'm pulling, periodically. I'm looking at this piece and looking at that piece, and I'm buying new books all the time. And there's like one piece I'm looking at because that's what attracted me to buy the book. Right through here, because I'm working on this exhibit with the California African American Museum, and I had been working on the research for Venice. I was doing a lot of field work and newspaper and article reading and looking at some of the archives for photo images that might exist in terms of public archives, and then going to talk to some families that have resources, photographs and other material that nobody has looked at. So that's more what I've been doing here recently.
Okay. Do you feel that you are living or have lived the California dream?
On some level, yes, I do feel that I have lived the California dream. I'm so happy that my mother's family moved here. And, you know, my father, I'm glad he moved here too. But, you know, my mom could have met somebody else too. I mean, I don't mean that in a bad way. I just mean that, you know, her family was the one that was here. Okay. They came here in the 20s. My dad came here in the 50s. Okay. So he came after he came with the big Great Migration is all I'm getting at. My mother's family came when
he was the,
Black folks here.
he was the second migration.
Yes.
That second migration. Okay.
Yes.
So
But for Los Angeles, that was really the big migration.
that was the big migration.
Yeah.
Do you have any advice for any young people to follow their dreams?
Just put one foot in front of the other and be fearless.
Be fearless. Alison, thank you very much for taking the time out for me to interview you. I appreciate you. And oh, I wanted to talk about your book art. Can you tell us about your book art?
Oh yeah, so I love that we were able to get Derek Adams to allow us to use one of his paintings as the basis for the artwork on the book. And he is involved in telling stories about the African-American experience in ways that are different from what a lot of other people are thinking about. He's interested in showing Black people in leisure and recreation just being, because a lot of folks don't think of us, we as ourselves, and other folks don't think of us as having these human experiences. And so we're articulating these ideas of self-fulfillment and humanity in similar theoretical and intellectual ways, but as it relates to, it manifests itself differently as it relates to what our practices are. Mine is text, his is visual imagery. So I'm excited that I had the opportunity to meet him and work with him.
Thank you, Alison.
Thank you.